I'm Chris Lee, joined by Blake Lovell. Today we are starting a preview of SEC football schedules. We are starting with LSU, Blake Lovell, because the Tigers have a schedule that is fascinating, not just because we don't know what to make of some of the teams on it, but we don't know what to think of the Tigers themselves, honestly.
Yeah, when you start breaking down schedules, that's a big part of it. Is it's easy just to look at the games, and of course, if you're talking about a team in the SEC, there's going to be challenges across the board when it comes to the conference games. And as we'll discuss, LSU's got one non-conference game in particular that's interesting. It'll be the one they have to open the season at UCLA. But I also think it's when you're doing this, you have to say, okay, you have to look at the team you're talking about as well. It's not just who the opponents are; it's what are the expectations for you. And I think for LSU, they're a really hard team to probably know exactly what you're going to get. A lot of starters returning on defense. I mean, their defensive unit should be better, but they were, the worst in FBS last year against the pass. They allowed, I think it was 323 yards per game through the air. And then, they are coming off of a 5-5 season. They've got new coordinators on both sides of the ball. Still don't know exactly what the quarterback situation is going to look like. So there's a lot of questions, I think, for LSU at this point. And that's where when you start to break down the schedule, it's like, well, you think LSU should win that game, but if things maybe don't go like we think they're going to, it could be a lot more interesting. I know that's why we're going to sort of break it down into different tiers because I think for LSU, it's made that range is a little bit wider than perhaps it would have been, the Joe Burrow year or something, because you would have felt like, all right, LSU should win this game, this game, this game, this game. They can win some of these games we're going to talk about, but are you going to feel 100% confident about that until you see how some of this stuff plays out? I don't think so.
Well, if you bookend LSU the last two seasons from the highs to the lows and all those things, I think you would have a challenge figuring out a tougher team in college football to figure out for the coming year because, as we know, LSU was national champions 2 years ago. Last year, LSU was just mediocre. Final record, I think, a 5-5, and you had in there the Florida upset, which really put a dent in Florida's season. That was an elite team at that point in time, and just so many ups and downs during the season last year. A blowout loss to Auburn, a narrow win over Arkansas, which probably didn't look great at the time, but turned out to be maybe a better win than I think a lot of people thought coming into the season. And you talk about the defensive struggles, which is interesting, but the Tigers had and still have one of the best corners in the country in Stingley. So, and then you look at last season and just the fact that COVID and the opt-outs and all those things, and LSU certainly hurt by that in its own way, really adds a confusing layer to anybody. LSU, not the least of that for the reasons we just mentioned, but there are just so many things that as we go through this game or these games on the schedule and we say these are the games they'll probably lose and they'll probably win and swing games, there may be somebody out there listening to us going, well, I don't have that as a swing game. I have that as a game that they lose or that they win. And really, it just depends on where you plant your flag on the Tigers in terms of what you think of them. And that's the problem because I think both of us don't know what to think of them.
There's a lot of you have to reach a bit, I think, for this team in particular to try to figure out. Again, I mean, because it is right. We don't see that often where a team that's what 2 years basically removed from a national championship has just completely revamped both sides of the ball in terms of coordinators and just sort of changing the way they want to do things after, I think what you would call a failed experiment in terms of maybe how things went last season. So you don't see that very often. And I think that's where, where is the consistency going to come? How quickly is that adjustment process going to be really on both sides of the ball? But like I said, I do think on the defensive side, there are some things that they can lean on there because they do have a lot of guys returning. You would think they should be improved there. And then it's just the offense. I mean, they've got an offensive line that has a lot, of experience. They've got starters returning there. The quarterback situation, I think, is going to be interesting. Max Johnson, Miles Brennan, those guys. How does that look? Their running back group, I think, is pretty deep. And then, wide receiver that they've got some potential breakout candidates there. So LSU is a top 25 team to start the season, but that range again is pretty wide probably in terms of where you expect them to be. And I think that's all going to come down to what's consistency look like? How quickly is that adjustment period on both sides of the ball? And can they take advantage of some of these opportunities they're going to have on their schedule? Because some of them, as we know, are going to be easier than others.
Okay, I have categorized these games into three categories. One I would call elite. Good luck to LSU to win those. The number two category I would call tough but winnable. I think these are fairly evenly matched games. Again, it depends on your opinion of LSU and maybe some of the teams they're playing too. And there's some teams in here on the schedule where there's a wide range of opinion too, which again adds another layer of interest. And then the games I'll call layups, I'll get to last. But elite, I think everybody would consider Alabama the consensus number one team in the country. Everybody has that I've seen so far. So obviously Alabama, no matter where that game is played, that's going to be a tough one to win. And then Texas A&M, which is right on that outside fringe of college football playoff contention under our current format. You could easily see the Aggies get in there depending on the outcome of that season. I think those are two games that I'm not saying LSU couldn't win them, particularly the A&M game, but that one's on the road, making it a little bit tougher. I think it would be tough for LSU to win either of those games, Blake.
It's going to be a challenge because I think, by that point, my thing is if you're going to play A&M, even though they are going to start, as preseason top 10 team, but my thing is if you're going to play them, you'd probably rather play them earlier in the season because, of the quarterback switch and knowing that, Kellen Mond's not there anymore and they are going to transition to a new quarterback. And I think, you would rather have to play that early on than probably wait till the end of the season when they're going to figure that out. And still, at that point, barring injuries and such, probably going to be a team that, is going to have a chance to be a double-digit win team and are going to be sitting in a pretty good spot and probably have some things figured out by the time you get to the end of November. So that's where I think, you have a disadvantage there if you're LSU of if you, let's say if they were the opener on September the 25th versus November 27th, maybe you have a different feeling on that, even though LSU is also, adjusting to new things. You feel like maybe there's a little bit closer of a gap there, but I don't know. I just think Texas A&M by that point is going to be a team that's just going to be kind of clicking on all cylinders and going to be in a really good spot. So that is going to be a challenge. No matter how much LSU progresses throughout the season, or let's say, maybe their offense is significantly better than we think it's going to be. Maybe their pass defense is significantly improved. I think either way, it's going to be a challenge. I still think it's winnable, but like you said, it's one you're going to put in that tier of, okay, this is going to be tough to get because you know what the expectations are for A&M. Meanwhile, for Alabama, let's just call it what it is. Like Alabama has dominated the series since 2012, and really hasn't looked back in doing so aside from the Joe Burrow year. I feel like we just said that's what we have to label it as because that's the one LSU won November 9th, 2019. LSU won that one 46-41. Aside from that, I think what's interesting is, yes, Alabama's won 9 of 10, but what also I find pretty fascinating is in all of those games outside of the Joe Burrow year where LSU scored 46 in that win that I just mentioned, LSU has not scored more than 17 points against Alabama in any of those 9 losses. So that is something that I think you really look at and say, my goodness, they have just not been able to find a way to crack the code there whenever Nick Saban has been in charge. And it's just very, very tough. And we've seen that for LSU. So that is certainly going to be a challenge, even though this is a series before this kind of, interesting dynamic has sort of flipped to where Alabama's controlled this thing. Yes, it is one where the road teams won, kind of a lot of games in this thing, but I think we're well past that at this point because it has been all Alabama, and knowing that, you have to go on the road, it's just going to make it even more challenging.
Yeah, the A&M game being at home, I think helps. That's something that you always look at, and order is important for reasons you mentioned. And you said one of the things I was going to get to, which was A&M breaking in a new quarterback. You'd rather have that game earlier, probably rather than late. I guess you could say that maybe some of that applies to LSU too, but LSU's quarterback situation, though uncertain, I think you've got some more known commodities there. So there's that, but there's also this thing where when you are a team that's been elite and you have expectations going in, which certainly LSU is going to have, part of how you play your season late is what you're playing for and what you banked. And to me, a lot of that's going to depend on, okay, is LSU having one of those seasons where they're humming along and maybe in position to make a New Year's Six bowl, that kind of thing, and then maybe there's some more motivation going into the A&M game, or does it go away where you are maybe struggling just to be 500 and there's talk about your coach's job and those sorts of things? This season, Auburn probably being the poster child for that kind of narrative. A lot of that depends on that too. Is like, it's not just the matchup and where it is, but how is your season going at that point? So I think that adds another layer of intrigue, because let's say this does go well for LSU. All of a sudden, that game, I think, becomes a lot more winnable on paper just under those dynamics.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, it's just, as we say every year, like it's so important, and it isn't any conference, but I think just the way the games fall in the SEC, and we know just how significant, one game slotted here, one game slotted there can be really on your entire season at times. And I know that may sound extreme, but I think when you kind of look at your schedule and you're like, okay, maybe some of our toughest games are spread out a bit, but also, knowing that there can be times where you are just week after week after week in a spot where there really are no let-ups. And I think that this is one of those schedules for LSU. Once you get maybe into that middle part, there, a couple games in there, but then as we're going to talk about, like, you've got games against teams like Florida, going to Ole Miss with a just completely perhaps dominant offense. And then you've got Bama and Texas A&M in there in a 3-week span. So I think that's what we say, like, with how these games are slotted, that can be a significant part of your success just based on how the schedule falls.
Okay, let's go into that mid-tier, which is where LSU season will probably be made or broken. I call these tough but winnable. They are 7 games. Let me go in the order that these appear on the schedule. UCLA in game 1, that one being on the road. The next one is at Mississippi State in game 4, followed by Auburn the next week. That is in Baton Rouge. Then you've got Kentucky in Lexington, which makes it a little bit tougher. Then you go, Kentucky being week 6, by the way, the next week or the next game being Florida. That is going to be in Baton Rouge, which Florida, I think most people consider to be a better team than the Tigers, but the Gators turn over a lot, particularly on offense. And again, that one being in Baton Rouge tilts that a little bit more back towards LSU from obviously where it would be if it were in Gainesville. And then Arkansas in week 10, another program where we don't know exactly where that's going after Sam Pittman's debut year, which I think surprised everybody. That is the last in that stretch. That is game number 10. Blake, which games in that 7-game stretch stand out to you?
Well, I think I think when you look at like Kentucky, I feel like is one of those interesting ones because remember, Chris, the last time these two played in Kentucky, that was quite a wild scene, I think. So like I think Kentucky's one of those, like we say, is probably better than people will give credit for just based on what Mark Stoops has done there. So that's one I find interesting, just in terms of kind of what the potential is for that going on the road. Again, it's kind of early in the season. I mean, I know it's almost that middle-way point, but it's kind of early. And then really the Mississippi State, like think back, right? Last year, I mean, Mississippi State scored 44 points on LSU last year. And that was not yet, Mike Leach's, I think, finest offensive team. Like he was not, I think they still are a work in progress, but yet they found a way to pretty much decimate LSU defensively last year. So having to play that one on the road, like that is, I mean, that could be challenging early in the season if LSU doesn't sort of figure some of those things out early on that we've talked about. Of course, Auburn, I mean, I know that's, they're kind of in rebuilding mode, but still, I think anytime LSU and Auburn play, it's going to be an interesting game. Of course, some of the others, Florida and like, I mean, really, you look up and down the line here. As we said, even if we, let's say, project LSU as a top 25 team in the preseason, I don't see, but maybe outside of the non-conference games minus UCLA, I mean, Arkansas, I feel pretty good about LSU beating Arkansas, but a lot of these, really every one of these games elsewhere in the SEC, I think are kind of, as you said, they're swing games, and I don't think you sit here and feel 75 to 100% sure that LSU is going to win, all of those games. And look, they probably won't, right? And they probably won't lose all of them either, but my point is, I think it's a lot closer than maybe you would perceive until you actually dig into the schedule a little bit. I mean, I think LSU should be better than Mississippi State. I think LSU should be better than Kentucky. I think they should be better than Auburn, but like Florida, Ole Miss with that offense, we talked about Bama and A&M. Like, I don't know that there are any guarantees that some of these games on the road I think are a little bit trickier than it may seem. Again, going to Mississippi State, a Mike Leach offense, going to Kentucky, a team that has actually been pretty good defensively, and I think they could cause some problems if LSU's offense isn't where it wants to be at that point in the season. Then going to Ole Miss, knowing that, again, Matt Corral, Lane Kiffin's offense, they're going to present some challenges. I don't care how good LSU's defense is. So, like, there's a lot of things that could go wrong in that scenario, but there's also a path for LSU to win some of these games, really build some confidence, and then go into the Alabamas and A&Ms feeling a lot better maybe about where they're at that point in the season.
Yeah, the two games on here that are just tough for me to get my arms around, again, not just because of we don't know what LSU is, but it's because we don't know what these other teams are. Let's go in order in which the Tigers will play them. The first is UCLA. UCLA brings almost its entire starting unit back on both offense and defense. And I have done a conglomeration of power rankings. I tried to find major media outlets that ranked all the teams in the FBS from 1 to 130. I plotted those out. I averaged them up. I took the standard deviation just to see the variance of opinion among these teams. UCLA came in that composite power ranking at 34, but the problem with the Bruins, Blake, standard deviation there of 18. No team higher in the ratings had a higher standard deviation. And just to put that in layman's terms, that is the diversity of viewpoint. In other words, if you rank 20, but everybody's got you 20, you've got a standard deviation of 0. If you rank 20, but one person's ranking you, 1 and one of them's ranking a 39, then that's obviously a difference of opinion. The average is the same, but the variance of opinion is wide. People are really split on UCLA. And, of course, we don't cover the Pac-12, so we are not quite as familiar. But I found that interesting. The other one, Mississippi State. And God help you when you watched that team last year as you tried to figure out what it was. Because sometimes I watched that team. It wasn't very good, particularly on offense, which was not what we expected with Mike Leach. And then you look at what State did at times. There was that shocking opening game where State rolls up all kinds of offense, beats LSU 34-4 in a game that really set a lot of the tone, I think, for LSU's season. But then State the rest of the year, had some moments here and there, but was just kind of mediocre. So to me, all these games are interesting, but those are the two that I really have the hardest trying to figure out what's going on. And then again, we talked about timing. With UCLA, you add to that it's a road trip and it's the first game of the year against a team that's going to bring back a lot of experience. I think that adds another dynamic that just makes it tougher to figure.
Yeah, I'd feel better if I was LSU flipping that from, let's say, opening against McNeese, then playing Central Michigan, then going to UCLA like in game 3. I feel like I'd probably feel a lot better about that than having to open the season. Again, as of right now, we don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be. And like I said, you mentioned that UCLA's got a lot of guys coming back, and I think specifically on that defense, they feel like they should, really perhaps be a unit that can do some good things there. And I mean, it's Chip Kelly's 4th season now, and they haven't won, which last year's a little different, but they haven't won more than 4 games in his first 3 seasons. But they feel like this is sort of that turning point for them. And so to open the season on the road, coming off a disappointing season if you're LSU, and again, they do have question marks that they have to figure out probably before they get to SEC play. Not a gimme by any means. So.
Yeah, and just one more piece of info on UCLA. The highest ranking I saw UCLA was 21, but some had them as low as 71. So that is a huge range of opinion on there. And frankly, for LSU, it's kind of the same thing. It's all some people have them as high as 7. Some have them as low as 26, which, again, I think is entirely defensible for the reasons that we would expect. But anything else on these, what we call swing games here, Blake, that stands out to you?
I just want to know real quickly, if you look at the odds as of right now, which, we're still a month away from this game, but I think I'm looking around. It looks like LSU as of right now is a 4 to 4.5 point favorite in some places. So, that's not huge. And like we said, that will obviously swing back and forth before the game actually happens on September the 4th. But that is at least, I think, noteworthy comparing those two teams as it stands right now.
Okay, let's circle to the last part of the schedule discussion. That's what I would call the layup games. McNeese State, Central Michigan, and ULM. ULM is supposed to be probably one of the 5 worst teams in the FBS. Of course, McNeese in the FCS, and it's been pretty good at times, but certainly that's not a game you would expect LSU to lose. In Central Michigan, which is piloted by former Florida coach Jim McElvain. So anything interesting about these 3 games, Blake?
Well, we know with McNeese, the interesting part is that Ed Orgeron's son, Cody, is the quarterback. So wouldn't that be something? If McNeese were to pull off the ultimate upset, I don't see that happening. Like you said, I really don't see much of a challenge in those games, really in any of them. I mean, I guess the Central Michigan one's interesting because they do have, I think, doing some research on them, I think they've got 10 starters returning on defense. They've got a pretty, I think, efficient offense at times. And because, you do have McElwain there, someone who's kind of known for his offense. Maybe, there's something, we've seen crazier things happen, I think, but I really don't see anything in there. Like I said, Central Michigan will probably offer the toughest challenge, but I don't even know that that's going to be one that you're going to be looking up and down saying, well, LSU's probably still a double-digit favorite in that game. But there's at least some interest there, given the, like I said, the storyline with McElwain. And, again, you feel like he's probably going to be able to pull out some things offensively that may do some stuff against LSU, but I think the defense for the Tigers will be too good. So,
well, it'll be interesting to follow the Tigers throughout the season. Be sure and follow us on our website, southeastern14.com. Follow us on Twitter at 14Southeastern. Go find us on YouTube. We've got a channel there that we've just started. We are putting our podcasts there. We're also cutting them up into smaller clips. And, of course, you can find our podcast, the 14 or the Southeastern 14, as we call it. We call it both, but you can find that where you get your podcast. Anyway, be sure and follow our coverage. We're also doing some preseason basketball work that people have found interesting. I'm Chris Lee. He's Blake Lovell. Thank you for listening to us today on the 14.